Good morning. For the last several weeks, we've been talking about the ruthless elimination of hurry, basically recovering our spiritual health in the midst of a world that's leaving little time for a relationship with God. So the first week I talked about the dangers of allowing yourself to be too busy to spend time with God. And last week I talked about a walk in the wilderness. I encourage you to do what? I encourage you to make taking some alone time a part of your spiritual life. And this week I want to talk to you about saving the Sabbath. Said another way, saving some time to relax with God. Now, you might be asking yourself why the Sabbath needs saving. It needs saving because we human beings tend to set the wrong priorities. We want what we want when we want it. To get what we want, we do what we do, even when we really shouldn't be doing what we're doing. And again, it's a priority issue. The time we should spend in Sabbath, we spend instead trying to get more of what it is that we want, doing what it is we shouldn't be doing. It's like we never have enough. About a month ago, just by way of illustration, about a month ago was Halloween, that special time of the year when kids dress up and they run around the neighborhood after dark, ringing strangers' doorbells and trampling on their flower beds and threatening bad behavior if they're not sufficiently bribed with candy. Basically, it's an entire evening dedicated to gluttony. Now, speaking of gluttony, don't even get me started on Thanksgiving or even worse, Black Friday. And because there's never enough time to say to our I want more and say to our I need more primal instincts, we now have Cyber Monday and really all Cyber Week. It's probably the only time all year that parents and let's be honest here, even encourage their kids to engage in this eagerly anticipated period of mayhem. Anybody here ever go trick-or-treating? Yeah? No? Maybe? Anybody here willing to admit you aided and abetted an underage juvenile in said egregious activity? Sinners one and all, what can I say? Here's the question for you though. Did any of you, while you were trick-or-treating, decide you had too much candy and started giving it away rather than picking up more? You knock on the door of some unsuspecting house, and when the person living there opens the door, you yell loudly, "Trick or treat!" And then you hand them a Baby Ruth, the candy bar, not your neighbor's kid. Anybody? No? No, for most of you. There's always going to be one oddball in the bunch, but what a shock. Here's the deal. We as human beings aren't really wired to be satisfied with anything less than everything. Do you want the double chocolate and caramel layer cake with the Oreo crumbles? Or do you want the peppermint ice cream with the hot fudge sauce, whipped ice cream, or whipped cream and a cherry on top? Again, here's the deal. If we only ever listen to our unrestrained greed, the answer is and can only ever be, yes, I want them both. I want them all. So where does this leave us? Well, we spent the last several weeks exploring the biblical implications of always being in too much of a hurry. The more stuff we try to get our hot little grubby hands on, the more time we need to spend in the pursuit of something that we can never, ever get. What is that something, you ask? That something is everything. And don't be fooled by thinking everything is physical stuff. Sometimes the something in question is doing something. We want to do it all. We want to have it all. We want to be all. All that stuff takes time, and that time means hurry. We've been looking at a book by Pastor John Mark Comer called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, to guide our conversation. Well, Pastor Comer talks about satisfaction and desire and how they drive our need for hurry. He writes this, he says, desire is the great motivator. It's the engine of our lives. It's the function, is to propel us out of bed and out into the world. But if at any point desire is no longer under our control and is instead driving our lives, we're in trouble. Because when you take a closer look at the dynamics of desire, you realize desire is one of those things that is never, ever satisfied. Desire is infinite. It has no limit. There is, and I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, there is no point at which it's ever satisfied. The problem is we're all finite. We all have sorts of limits. In the language of math, infinite desire minus finite soul equals restlessness. We live with chronically unsatisfied desires, like an itch that no matter how many times you scratch, it doesn't go away. No matter how much we see, we do, we buy, we sell, we eat, we drink, we experience, we visit, etc., we always want more. He goes on to write a little later, what do we do with all of this pent-up, unsatisfied desire, this restlessness? Well, human desire is infinite because we were made to live with God forever in this world, and nothing less will ever satisfy us. So our only hope is to put our desire back in its proper place on God, and to put all that other desires in their proper place below God. Ultimately, nothing in this life apart from God can satisfy our desires. Tragically, we continue to chase after our desires ad infinitum. The result? A chronic state of restlessness, or worse, angst, anger, anxiety, disillusionment, depression. All of which lead to a life of hurry, a life of busyness, overload, shopping, materialism, careerism, a life of more in which, in turn makes us even more restless, and the cycle spirals out of control. So what is the best way to counter restlessness? How about rest more-ness? Or since that's a made-up word, how about something more biblical in etymology? How about Sabbath? The Hebrew word Shabbat is the word we get Sabbath from. Shabbat literally means to stop. Think about many of the commercials that you see on TV or YouTube or your digital domain of choice. A guy and a gal sipping a Corona with a lime in the neck of a bottle while resting on the beach. You hear the sound of seagulls and the lapping of waves, and the camera pulls back and they're actually on their backyard deck with a kiddie pool. A couple of rugrats jumping up and down on mom and dad while they're resting in bed. Meanwhile, the smell of fresh coffee brewed is wafting into their bedroom from their kitchen. The new programmable Mr. Coffee 6000 has done its thing. Some best buds sitting on a couch, watching the big game, spilling popcorn between the cushions, resting. Pastor Comer points out that we are bombarded by images of Sabbath, of Shabbat, of stopping, because at some unconscious, subconscious level, we long for it. Just as we're wired for the infinite because we're made in God's image, we long for Sabbath because we're made in God's image. I think you know where I'm going with all of this. Hurry is the antithesis of Sabbath. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. Sometimes life gets in the way of Sabbath. We see this multiple places in the Bible. It's okay. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, don't fall into the trap of making Sabbath a subject of legalism. It's no longer Sabbath if it's a mandate. Do you understand that? If it's a mandate with no flexibility? Duty is no substitute for rest and relaxation and taking in the God-inspired, God-created, God-endorsed view of his wondrous creation. What do you mean, Pastor Andy? I'm confused. I want to rest, but I never seem to have the time. Now you're telling me, Pastor Andy, that I don't have to honor the Sabbath, but I really should? I should, but I don't have to? Which is it? Well, it's always time to help people if the need is truly there. The key is discernment. When it comes to enjoying a Sabbath, learn to say no to an interruption when that interruption is not necessary, and yes to the interruption when that interruption is necessary. Let me explain what I mean by this by looking at two biblical passages to make my point. The first set of verses comes from Matthew 12:1 and beyond, and it goes like this. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples, they're doing what's unlawful on the Sabbath." He answered, "Haven't you read what David did while he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read the law that the priest on the Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are held innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, 'I desire mercy, not sacrifice,' you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Going on from that place, he, being Jesus, went into their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against him, against Jesus, they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "If any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore," and this is the important part, "therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." We see a second example in Mark 6:30. This is the section of Mark that sets up the feeding of the 5,000. You all know about the feeding of 5,000? 5 loaves of bread, 2 fish fed 5,000 people with more left over after they had fed everybody than when they started. Remember that one? Yes, no? Well, I don't want to talk about that story. I want to talk about what happened just before it in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus and the boys, they've been busy. They're tired, they're hungry, they're missing Monday night football. They need some Sabbath downtime. This is Mark 30 and beyond. The apostles gathered around Jesus and they reported to him all they had done and taught. And then because so many people were coming and going, they didn't have a chance to eat. Jesus said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." A quiet place. There's that eremos word that we talked about last week. Desert, wilderness, desolate place, quiet place. And so they went by themselves in a boat to a solitary eremos place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns, and they got there ahead of them. And when Jesus landed, he saw a large crowd and he had compassion on them. And because they were like sheep without a shepherd, so he began to teach them many things. So let me share a bit of what Pastor Comer writes on this. He says this, he says, "Life happens. People happen. You set aside some time to Sabbath or pray or just take the night off with no plan, but then you get a text from your boss, a minor crisis at work. Your 2-year-old swallows a Lego Kai Ren piece and you Google, closest emergency room. Your roommate has a bad day and could use a chat. 2 hours later, she's still crying. Thousands of people are banging down your front door asking you to heal them and teach about the kingdom of God because they believe you're the long-awaited Messiah. You know, just ordinary life stuff. Sound familiar? You feel like you try and try and try, and you just can't get time to rest. You're in good company, by the way, when this happens to you. You're in the company of Jesus himself. But again, that's still not the end of the story. A boy's backpack and 5,000 lunches later, we read this. We read Jesus made his disciples get into a boat and go on ahead of him to Bethesda while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on the mountainside to pray. Translation, Jesus finally took some Sabbath time. Yes, he acknowledged that he had an interruption and it was important. And so he allowed the Sabbath to be interrupted, but then he returned to his Sabbath time. Remember, I was talking about the need for discernment when to say no to interruptions and when to say yes? Pastor Comer makes an observation based on the 11 times in the Gospel of Luke that it makes a reference to this word eremos, or quiet place, or desert place, or wilderness, or wherever it is he's going to go to pray, in relation to taking Sabbath time for oneself. 11 times. For example, one of those 11 times, Luke 5:16, goes like this. Jesus often withdrew to lonely places, eremos places, and what? And prayed. Comer writes this. He writes, you can chart Jesus' life along two axis points. The busier and more in demand and famous Jesus became, the more he withdrew to his quiet place, his eremos place, to pray. Usually for us, it's the exact opposite. When we get excessively busy or life is hectic and people are vying for our time, the quiet place is the first thing to go rather than our first place to go. The first thing we lose is unhurried time to just sit with God in quiet, to pray, to read a psalm, take an internal inventory, let our souls catch up with our bodies. Let's get back to the genesis of this whole Sabbath thing. In fact, let's look at Genesis chapter 1. You see what I did there? Yeah. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Skipping a few verses, by the seventh day, God had finished the work that he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. Pastor Comer writes this. He says, I'm not really into the Sabbath. I'm an extrovert and I just like to stay busy. God rested. I get the Sabbath thing, but I work a demanding job that I love and I just can't make the time because God rested. I've got 2 little kids at home and it's just not really doable right now. Maybe later when, I suspect you know where I'm going with this. God rested. And in doing so, he built a rhythm into the DNA of creation, a tempo, a syncopated beat. God worked for 6, rested for 1. When we fight this work 6 days, Sabbath 1 day rhythm, we go against the grain of the universe. And to quote the philosopher H.H. Farmer, if you go against the grain of the universe, you get splinters. Okay, folks, let me end with one final thought. Do you remember me saying the Hebrew word for Sabbath was Shabbat? Shabbat literally means to stop. Here's the deal, though. It has another meaning: to delight. In essence, on the seventh day, God Shabbated to Shabbat in what he created. God stopped to delight in what he created. Now here's the thought. Maybe we can do the same thing? Let's pray. Dear Lord, Help us to save the Sabbath. Help us to Shabbat so that we can Shabbat in the work of our hands and the work of your hands. Help us to Sabbath so that we can spend time with you and grow closer to you. Help us to hurry up and slow down. Lord, help us to be faith-filled, big thinking, bet the farm risk takers. Never insulting you, God, with small thinking or safe living. May the love of Christ abide in all of us so that by the examples of our lives, we may show the world what it is to be a Christian. All this I pray in your Son's name. Amen.